I'm Camila. I'm an investor at Construct Capital. We are an early stage venture firm focused on foundational industries, which essentially means we're betting on the industries that are the foundation of our economy, more than half of the GDP, including supply chain logistics. That's one of the areas that we spend a lot of our time on. So I wanted to share a little bit of, which one is the right way? A little bit of why AI is really meant for supply chain, but also why it's so damn hard. And I think Harish talked about this a little bit, so I'm going to go quite quick here. But the reality is that supply chain is a bit of a mess, right? It is fragmented across multiple players. And in order to bring a shipment from point A to B, you need to touch many, many hands. And I do think that the point that AI is changing, eating the world is true, but it's very different changing, moving data versus moving actual trucks, containers, ships, shiploads, and so on. And I think one of the reasons why AI is great is because we do have this unstructured data that is broken across multiple communication channels, multiple systems, and so on. At the same time, the part that is hard is that this is a very high stakes environment in which everything needs to happen real time. And if you make any error, that can lead, as you guys know, multiple millions of dollars in costs and efficiencies and so on. So it can't get it wrong because it has real consequences in the real world. And that is why AI is also harder to gain adoption. When we think about AI, I mean, I think the technology itself is constantly changing, but we try to abstract this into a framework that's quite easy for us humans to understand. This is actually borrowed from a robotics framework that explains how intelligent systems work, which how humans work. Like, right, the way we think about any problem is that first we need to understand what's happening. That's when we look at data. That's when we make calls. We ask someone, hey, where's the status of this shipment and so on. From there, we have to think, like, what does this mean? So this shipment actually departed late from point A. So what does this mean in terms of when it's going to arrive? So we need to reason. We need to think about it. And later on, then we should act. Like, what should we do about it? Okay, then I'm going to call this alternative vendor. We're going to reroute this point A to point C, and so on. AI is actually great for each one of the steps. So on the sense piece, this is where we talked about turning unstructured data into structure. AI is really good at this because in the past, what we used to have is have to organize all the data into a ERP, a data table, Excel. Now we can actually get all the broken PDFs that are spread across multiple channels in the email and actually make sense of it. So the first part is actually helping make sense of the data, turn the chaos and the structure to sense. And this is where OCR comes in, the natural language processing, and so on. The second piece is the reasoning. And this is where we add context. And this is really powerful, right? We can train your AI model and fine tune on your SOP, on the way you operate. You can actually add context and meaning to the data that you're seeing. And the last piece, but this is really the powerful one, is how to actually act. So most of systems that we've seen in the prior slide, all the ERP, TMS, and so on, they've been systems of record. That's how the past decade have been operating on. We help make sense of the data. We think we create insights, dashboards, and so on. But there's still an operator that needs to look at it and actually act. And AI is actually turning that into the last step and doing the end-to-end workflow in which you can actually turn that systems of record into systems of action. We've seen a number of different AI players in the space, some of which are here that we very much admire the work. And there have been a couple of things that we learned across the time from these incredible founders and operators. The first step is that the first is basically table stakes at this point. Just structuring the data is great, but AI is good at doing this, and this is not something that will really differentiate. Thinking does help, and adding context is actually quite hard. We all know that there are multiple stakeholders, but if you don't act, that actually is not going to change the real ROI. ROI comes from acting, and this is where we actually change, not only based on cost, but also revenue, cash, and so on. And we see more and more players that actually are doing this less as a SaaS, per seat basis, but actually based on outcome, right? Actually capturing the value they're generating. And I think that's actually something really powerful because we're totally changing the mindset from how we used to price, what we're actually delivering. The fourth, and this is actually a bit of like against the point that Harish made, is that I actually think that in supply chain, you got to respect the user. They've been decades operating this really hard industry. And so you should not be trying to teach them how to do their job. You actually should embed themselves into their workflows in a seamless way because they're going to continue doing the things that they're doing. If you give them a insane AI that they don't understand, guess what? They're not going to use it. They're going to continue sticking with their spreadsheet that are full of colors and different tabs and different filters. And the fifth one is that you don't get a second shot. I think in a very busy world that we're in, especially now with tariffs and all the chaos that exists in the world, if you don't deliver ROI and value in the first 30 days, you're done. So this is a very high stakes environment for AI. With that, I'm gonna stop talking, actually turn this into Q&A to actually someone that's been operating the space. Valentina Jordan is co-founder, CEO of Nauta. So we're gonna talk a little bit of how this turns into action, do more of a back and forth here. I got a couple of questions, so I'm gonna get started.
Perfect.
So we talked about how Freight AI starts by sensing what's happening, right? Bringing visibility into all that kind of chaos and mass. So tell us a little bit about who's your customer and what they're actually struggling to stay on top of.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for being here. Nauta's approach has been a little bit different. We actually have been focusing on the importer. Because if you think about it, the importer is the one who's paying the checks and owns the data. Without a purchase order, there's no truck to drive, there's no boat, there's no container to ship, right? So for the past months, we have been building directly focused on what the importer is and trying to control what their pain, their true underlying pain is, and it's control. And listening to the other speakers, the underlying messages, I need to know where things are, I need to control when things are arriving. And that's the pain that all of the stakeholders have across the board. So we have been really, really narrowing down on how do we empower and give control back to the importer, which is the person who is paying the bills for everyone here, right? And how do we do that? Through data structuring, a lot of automation, but also understanding and respecting that what they need is to increase their fill rate.
That's great. We talked about how insight without action doesn't actually move freight. So where are your customers actually seeing the biggest ROI once Nauta starts taking action?
Yeah, and this is a great question because I think that still in the industry, everyone thinks about ROI and it's cutting costs, right? How do I reallocate people that were doing certain operational jobs, like taking calls, checking where the container is or the freight is. And yeah, this is beautiful. We can certainly reduce costs. But really where we're seeing the impact on Nauta customers is on revenue and cash. And the beautiful part about this is that this doesn't only apply to the logistics aspect of the business, but it impacts the CFO, the procurement department, the sales department, right? Which are all being impacted through the logistics team. So cost reduction, again, beautiful, but our focus is to other things. How do we increase revenue? Through fill rates. Everyone here needs the product available. That's the underlying objective of what we're all doing. So Nauta increases product availability by 2 to 3%. And then cash on hand, again, another huge pain that we don't speak too much about in the industry. And we increase cash on hand by 10 to 15%, but really connecting from the order to the inventory. So that's really how we've seen to really generate these aha moments and value really, really fast for clients.
That's a good point. And the worst thing is that you have a sale, but you actually don't have the inventory.
Product.
Yeah, so then
Exactly.
the sale doesn't happen. We've seen that, well, at least we talked about that operators don't want to be retrained. So what has worked for Nauta in building trust and making this adoption frictionless?
Yeah, this is a little bit contradictory to everything that we've heard here. One thing that I would say really stands true with our experience is that this is not immediate. It doesn't take 30 days. It doesn't take a pilot to you for actually see the change of AI and the impact, the true value. But one thing that is really important is to respect and have empathy for the operator. The Excel has been there for decades. The email continues to be there for decades. We can't expect to come in and replace everything. So what has really worked for us is to mimic what feels comfortable for the operator that has been there for decades. So the Excel-like experience, keyboard shortcuts, everything that feels really familiar, that's what has really worked for us and what allows a very fast implementation so that we can reach that aha moment and the ROI as fast as possible.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We actually talked about this a little bit before the panel, just how obviously the change will happen, but there are ways of building trust. And I think that you mentioned something I thought it was interesting, that sometimes people even want like the print button, because that's what they do. They print and they have it save the file so later on they can go back to the record. So like we want to change necessarily how they behave, but over time you can once you build the trust.
It's a process. I always say to my customers, I haven't been able to change my husband's behavior in 8 years. You can't expect to come in and change everything in 2 weeks. It just doesn't happen.
All right. Well, we talked about systems of records versus systems of action. So how does Nauta fit around this legacy stack without necessarily ripping it out?
Yeah, this is also extremely important. And I would love to hear more people talk about unstructured data, which, again, it's the tip point of everything with AI. But the crazy part about logistics is that you have TMS, ERPs, WMS, EDIs, APIs, just crazy amounts of information flowing from everywhere. So where Nauta actually comes in, imagine as a membrane that connects all of these systems and creates a single source of truth. So we don't want to rip off the ERP. We don't want to rip off the TMS or the WMS. What we do is that we connect all of their data so that everyone within an organization has the same information, right? Which is always a silo. We always talk about silos and fragmentation. We're that membrane that connects everything through data and automation.
Awesome. You've built around orchestration for importers. I'm curious about, what's there for Nauta in terms of next, in terms of the X layers, customers, categories going deeper over time in the act phase.
Yeah, so logistics, global trade, importing is broad and just such a huge industry. We focused on importers of non-durable goods, so think pharmacy, food, retail. We're expanding into additional categories. But more than that, we're really, really focusing on taking from order to actually inventory and product availability, covering the full scope of the operation, which, as everyone here knows, it's a dozen players involved, and the operator can't do anything without synchronization of all of these players. So it's all about connecting all of the dots through data orchestration.
Great. Well, we're going to join a panel later on, and we'll be here. So
any questions?
Talk
Thank
more.
you.